Hello, everyone. My name is Annalise Diaz. I'm the Education Director at Pennsylvania Shakespeare Festival, and I am happy to be with a small group of PSF actors who have been part of PSF's Extreme Shakespeare productions. Today, we will be chatting about the Extreme Shakespeare process. So hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your quarantine or wherever you are to chat about the Extreme Shakespeare process. So just to get us started, Eric, do you mind giving us an overview of what the Extreme Shakespeare process is for those who may not know and how it differs from a traditional rehearsal process?
Yes. The Extreme Shakespeare is a 4-day rehearsal period as opposed to approximately 4 weeks for a normal production. It has no director or designers. We meet, we have been instructed to memorize our lines. We receive a cut script in advance, and we are actually paid for a week prior to showing up to rehearse for the memorization process. And during that time, you should also be thinking about costumes and looking at your closet and things that you might be able to use, and choices. Acting choices, because once you get there, we just have to go, and we do it in 4 days, including a little tech. There's no recorded. I think there's some recorded sound possible, but we often just have like analog live sound, and there's a rudimentary light plot available to us, and we have a kind of a tech, but it's very minimal. We raid the costume shop, so they do make available some costumes for us, and there's a portion of those 4 days is taken through kind of guided chaos in the costume shop, so we can find things that we might need, and oftentimes you're inspired in the moment because you see a crazy wig and you go, oh, that's great for my character, or something like that. But and then we do it, and we run it for 2 weeks, 16 performances. Other than that, it's just the same as a regular production.
So you mentioned that there's no director. Brandon, what is it like working with no director in the room? Does a natural director emerge, or is every decision left up to the group as a whole?
Well, it's a little scary when you're first getting into the process, because you're like, how is this going to work? And, how is everyone's egos going to mesh? But the 2 times that I have done it, I have found that there are usually people that step up into the role of not necessarily being a director, but sort of being the person who's putting some guidance on it. Usually they're usually some of the older actors that are working on the show. Or actors that have had experience working with the show, perhaps, that have a certain knowledge of it, that they spread to the group. So that does naturally occur, which is great, especially for someone who, like me, who I get kind of lost, and I'm like, oh, I'm not sure. I remember when I did Troilus and Cressida with Lindsay, a lot of times I knew I could go to Lindsay if I needed an assist for something, or just to like throw an idea at or get some clarity on something. So it really is like a system of some people stepping up, and also just being able to rely on your fellow performers to be there for you.
That's a good segue into Katie. You joined the Extreme Shakespeare process for the first time last season in Henry IV Part 1. What was that like, being in that process for the first time?
Yeah, it was extreme. It was I think it was a funny combination of things, with it being such an extreme event in and of itself, and also it being my first time at the festival in general. So I found there was a lot of like hiccups, that I think about my personal process that I was having to navigate at the same time, like the layout of the building, or knowing like where the costume shop is, or everything was so condensed that it was just like having to multitask all of the time, which was really exciting and also very exhausting, which was like learning all new people and also what's kind of you know, you've done all your, as Eric said, we show up ready to go. But I didn't really have a concept of what that meant in this, having never seen it at PSF and I never done something like that before. You know, I really did just have like only my text work. And now I think I see all the other things that would be so useful to you. Like I wasn't even thinking about my closet before, which now I know is very helpful because then you'll know that you have things that you can wear that you bring. I think I wound up wearing like a workout top and things worked, you know, it was like very simple, but there's all these other like elements that I would, if I get the chance to do it again, I'd be like, oh, I really want to make sure that I do all of my homework and learn my stuff and also think about the bigger picture so that I can also be of service. I was very lucky. Brandon and I were both in Henry IV last year, and the group that I was in was just very giving. And there were a number of people who had done the show itself before and had done Extreme Shakespeare and had been at the festival a lot. So everybody was just very generous. And I mean, I don't think I would have made it if it wasn't for the help of those other people. I feel like I wasn't able to really give back in that way. You know, it feels like it's such a wonderful ensemble building experience that I feel like one of the first things I learned was that you have to like get out of your own way in both like receiving and giving notes, you know, like I was like so grateful anytime anybody would come up and be like, hey, just take it or leave it, but this might be helpful to you here, or if you face this way, we're going to hear you more, or because you don't have a director guiding you in the way that we're used to. And so I just loved that everybody was really kind of pitching in and giving their thoughts, but also not having their ego. I found it to be a very like wonderful process in that way. And so it did leave quite a lasting impression. I really enjoyed it. It was highly stressful in a very good way. I can say that knowing that we survived now, you know, but it was wild and I really loved it.
You touched briefly on the actor's preparation. Lindsay, can you speak to what the actor needs to do to prepare to get into the room?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think everybody here that's voiced it, it's a scary thing to start this process without having a director in mind, or, you know, a director's vision to even latch on to, or even in the audition room where you're, you know, get some feedback from the director and what the into the play is. And so for me, I had to really start thinking about like, what is this play about for me? Even, you know, regardless of what we end up with as a collective, but what is the play about? And that's a really tough thing to do, particularly with Shakespeare, because you know, the tendency is to just say, well, we'll just do the play. But I think we have to also keep in mind, what does this play mean today, and why should we be doing it? So that's part of the process, and then figuring out, you know, how your character fits into the world, and how you can start to realize what are the core things for you as an artist in this piece. And then you get into, you know, the room with everybody else, and they've all done this kind of work, and seeing the play from their own vision, and trying to find how we all fit together is such a wild, crazy, rushed thing. But what's interesting about it, I know this is not about preparation, but it's more about the practice, but still, when you finally get to that first rehearsal day, and you're, you know, to a certain degree, hopefully off book to a certain extent, but I don't think anybody is actually ever completely off book. You start to rediscover the play in a really magical way, because it's not just one vision, it's everybody just throwing their passion into making this play work. And it's a real mosaic of ideas that it's fascinating. It's scary, and you become a really great communicator in how you approach somebody else's art and somebody else's passion that they're putting into this project. And so you have to kind of do your work, the research, the history of the play, the text work, but then come to it with a openness to see what everybody else is bringing to the table. And that's such a great thing.
I had the opportunity as an acting intern to be part of All's Well That Ends Well with Susie and Eric, and I was just in awe on the first day. Well, being in a traditional rehearsal process, you have a couple days where you do table work, and you get to know everybody, and I was so in awe of that first day where everybody was just on their feet, and that was so exciting to see everybody's ideas just coming together in such a short amount of time. So that being said, I wanted to talk about once those 3 or 4 days are up and the show is performing in front of an audience, Susie, does it ever stay the same? Is it locked in, or does the show change along the way?
Oh, I would say it changes. It changes quite a bit because any show, whether you've had 4 days or 4 weeks of rehearsal, once you add the element of the audience, it is just naturally going to change every aspect of each of the performances, and then collectively the piece as a whole. And in this particular process, it's all so eclipsed that you're out of the gate, you're already working in a sense at performance level, at least with that in mind, because while that's always the goal, you just have kind of a luxury of working towards that organically with some time. And this just isn't that process. It's just a very different process. So once you add the audience, those, particularly the first few performances, as you finish out that first week, there's tech, and then generally we do it if we can for an audience, in-house kind of audience, and there are photos, and then you've got a regular audience. That learning curve is so steep that my experience has been the show just explodes into kind of more of what it actually is meant to be. All the hard work really pays off. And by that Sunday evening performance, at least for me, it feels like we're fully into a run of a regular show. It just feels like a regular run, although it doesn't feel that way on the night of the first performance. It is absolutely a tightrope act with no net, or at least it feels that way.
So the process is led by the cast of the actors, and I'm thinking back to last year's production of Henry IV, which had some fight scenes. How are the fights choreographed, and who is designated fight captain for either Katie or Brandon?
Well, Brandon, I don't know if there were the other one that you did, if there were fights, but at least last year it seemed like we were very lucky in that one of the actors, a number of actors had a lot of fight experience, but Dane really took the lead and sort of just coming up with some really solid ideas before we got there, and was very open to, changing them, but to kind of give us sort of like a target. But I found that very helpful because, it's such an important part of the storytelling, that having just something to think about, and just an area to start in and then grow from, I found to be very helpful. I don't know if that happens all of the time or if we were just lucky, or if anybody else can shed light on that. But I was grateful that somebody was kind of using a lot of their brain power to think in a larger scope about the fights.
Yeah. As Katie said, for Henry in particular, Dane did come in with some ideas about some of the fights. With both my experiences doing the Extreme Shakespeare with the fights, I think the idea was always sort of like keep it as simple as possible. Tell the story, but without the moves don't have to be uber elaborate, because just not enough time to really dive into them like that. So it was always just sort of keeping it as simple as possible, and you know, doing as little moves as possible to tell the story of the fight. So where it might just be like somebody runs at somebody, you know, blocks that, and then there's an attack and another attack, and then it's over.
Yeah.
Which is great because it even those little fights getting to the shows, it still felt like it was still a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think that something that was particular to this experience was that, you know, you're rehearsing on the stage, and you're sharing rehearsal time and space. So while, you know, some people could go off and practice their fights, we only have, it's all the costume pulls, all the fight stuff, all the rehearsing together as an ensemble all happens in the same 4 days. So, you know, you can only lose your hell so much to be off practicing fights. You can only, and your brain can also only, you know, ingest so much new information and like really get it under your belt. And with fights, you want to make sure not to injure anyone. So because I think you might have most success, or at least it felt like it, telling the story, as Brandon was saying, with like clear movements that we could make sure we could repeat safely while also getting the costumes and getting everybody on stage when they need to be on stage. But that was a very particular, I think, kind of piece of the time management puzzle, where I distinctly remember, I think, there being a day sort of towards the end of the weekend when Mayron and I were rehearsing something, and I think we both were like, yeah, I think this is the limit. We can't learn anything new. I think the fight will have to be this, and we'll have to just get better at it, because we might have just reached the end of the road of like new stuff to go in. And so we just would have to work that over and over again.
So earlier on, Eric mentioned that everyone raids the costume shop. What is that like, and how does everyone choose their own costume? And is there any help from anyone, or are you just left to your own devices?
I've done a number of these, and it is a bit of a free-for-all in the best possible sense. I specifically remember Megan Deal helping me one year specifically, and other time, you know, I think it depends on what your specific needs are. Some people go in and go, I know exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for, and as soon as they find that, they're good to go. Other people, you know, sometimes you go in and you have to kind of try a few things before you land on it. But it's a really, really fun part of the process, I think, and it comes at just the right time. Usually on the second day, on that Saturday, it comes at a really good point in the process, I think.
Yeah, I'd also like to say that it's so exciting to see what everybody chose. Like that point was, like, I remember during Troilus and Cressida, and I was playing Agamemnon and seeing what the army looks like, see who all my soldiers look like. And it's like, oh, that's who we are. That's what it's a great way to unify. You know, I was talking earlier about all those like ideas of what the play is. It's a way that the cast can be unified, even if there's like costumes that feel totally outside the box. Somehow you have to incorporate that and make that part of the story. I remember Tony Lawton had some like breastplate thing with I was like,
he had a kilt
with a beret and a kilt, and I was like, okay, you just have to go with it. And it's exciting to face that challenge of trying to incorporate that other piece and make some really interesting visuals.
I believe Tony tries to wear that beret every time he does the hit and run.
I believe it made an appearance last year as well, didn't it?
I believe so.
That makes sense.
Looking towards the script of the show, who decides on the cuts of the script and what scenes will be moved or if they'll be omitted if there is no director?
It's assigned, but I will say that we do, I think particularly in the production of Pericles, in my experience, we ended up rewriting a lot of the cut because there's that narrator character that we had to account for in a way that was, we encountered that was creating a lot of difficulty for us. And so we started to share those lines with people. I can't remember the exact details, but we, in addition to rehearsing the play, were reshaping the cut because we encountered like insurmountable issues with it. And it still ended up being really, really magical, I thought, which it always has in my experience. And I've been in 4 and I've seen 2 or 3, and it's always really, really, really beautiful.
You're right, Eric. I'm glad you brought up Pericles, because that was an insurmountable problem, which happened. I mean, it was pretty late in the game too, that we were still struggling with that, as I recall.
Yeah.
And yet it ended up being one of the most magical, once we did solve that problem somehow. It's all a blur. It was great. You're right.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Okay, so I'll wrap up with one final question, which everyone can answer. What advice would you give to another actor who would be entering this process for the first time?
Well, it has to be said, learn your lines. I mean, that just has to be said. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? I mean, honestly, I know that goes without saying and all. And I know we've already said that, I mean, there is kind of a sense that no matter how well you think you know them or how familiar you feel like you are with the whole play, it is another ball game when you go, oh, right, there will be people sitting in those seats in, a matter of hours. And part of what makes this whole process so magical, again, to use Eric's word, is that it is tremendously fun. And I think the audience intuits or can see the fun, the excitement, the exhilaration of sort of just of allowing this process to take over. And the only way you can really get to that is if you come in strong with that core knowledge of what you're doing. And it's never more true than in this process. And I'll also say that if you can survive this process, it makes any other production you work on feel, in respect to this, a bit of a cakewalk. You just have so much time. But it's that would be, you're gonna have more fun if you can really buckle down and do the homework kind of in a vacuum. That's true. Yeah. You're on your own, learning those lines. It's drudgery, but it's the only way to really have fun doing the process.
And I think what Susie said is right. It's really, really fun if you're really prepared, and then you can sort of adjust what you had, and you can start playing with your castmates, and they're all great. There's a lot. That's what I usually find is like, oh wow, you're no longer in a vacuum, but you're really prepared, but you're able to, Sanford Meisner, the acting teacher, always says, prepare and improvise. And the more prepared you are, the more you can improvise, is the thought. So I guess I'm seconding Susie on that, because it opens you up to really collaborate if you're not really insecure on your own part,
I would say also, in addition to being ready, being prepared is probably, the first kind of step, but also once you're there, be generous both with your castmates and with yourself. Be generous that you're not gonna, there's a lot of fear that happens when you step into a process like this. There's fear when you go into any rehearsal room, and anxiety about like what's the right way to do, what's the right way forward. But just be generous with yourself in in a way that you're sharing what's happening inside of you with everybody else, right? You're sharing your point of view, and be generous with other people sharing their points of view. And it's such a great learning way to learn the show, and that discovery is really exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, I would second that. I think that you discover quickly, if you've done more than one of these, or even during your first one, that people who are really rigid or not being as generous as they can be, it doesn't work very well. You have to be open-hearted and generous for it to work, and it quickly becomes evident that it's a problem to do otherwise.
And it's not about being nice, it's about actually just sharing your point of view. It's not just like sitting back and giving way to people. It's about saying, hey, I'm seeing something happening over here, and two other people might be not willing to speak up and say, oh yeah, I saw that too. Let's work on that. And so crowdsourcing this director role is part of that generosity.
Yeah, I obviously going to say preparing is truly important. Give yourself more time than you think you need.
Yeah.
For sure. But I would also say embrace the whole process of it. It's a really crazy ride, and you're going to get like a ton of adrenaline from it. But embrace that, and embrace that you're not doing the show by yourself. It can feel, I know my first time going into it, where it was like, oh, I have to do so much. It has to, but it's not like that at all. Obviously you have to do your work, but everyone's there to make the show as good as possible, regardless of the size of their role. So I would say that's a really important element of it. And also, don't be too hard on yourself about the whole process of it. The truth of the matter is that the audiences actually kind of want to see you mess up a little bit. That's exciting for them, because they're like, how could you do this? So in a way, it's a weird combination of like, there's a lot of pressure on you, but there really shouldn't be in some ways, because the audience knows what you're going through. So they don't expect it to be a show that's had 3 to 4 weeks of rehearsal. And what you do in those 4 days is going to amaze them.
Yeah. And there's such an element of self-direction and group direction that it also, once you're kind of into the run, the panic and the terror kind of gives way to such a sense of ownership that I'm not sure I typically feel in traditionally, outside director projects where I fill my particular role. I know what I'm doing, but I didn't necessarily have a say in the whole rest of it. The sense of ownership on a personal level, and then collectively, I mean, it is, I don't think I've done now, I believe 5, it might be more, it's somewhere in that neighborhood. And every single time I go through a whole process, it's the same every time, where halfway through the rehearsal process, that's like day 2, I go, oh, never again. And by the time we close, I'm like, it's the best, I love these people, I'm never gonna get better than this. It feels that way every time. It is such a deep and fulfilling process. It really is.
Yeah, I would echo everything that has already like eloquently been said. I mean, I think we all stress preparation because you just got to. But I think in some funny way, that becomes like memorizing your lines kind of becomes like the least, the lowest rung, and just really feel like my advice to somebody doing this would be like, I say that's the lowest rung, meaning that like showing up, having taken care of all of that and having it so within your body as much as you can. you know, we all know that like there you get to that and then you throw all the distractions in the new environment and then it just like goes someplace else. But as much as you can, having that all under your belt just gives you the confidence to do everything else that we've already been saying, which is like being of service to your other teammates. And I really think I didn't, like if I were to also go back and do it again, one of the things I would really think about is how to zoom out and just really be thinking about your tiny piece and the whole. I feel like normally when we're doing, I think we do that kind of naturally anyway as time goes on throughout our rehearsal processes, but I think it's just really needed in this particular extreme version because so many other people are gonna be relying on you and you're gonna wanna be able to help. And yeah, I think like Lindsay was saying earlier, you know, somebody's gonna need to tell me that you can't hear me because I keep ignoring this side of the audience, or and we're going to need everybody's eyes and ears. And so to be able to have flexibility to do that, I think you have to be able to detach yourself from your own fear if you don't have your prep kind of all together, because there's just so many things that will be coming at you that's like, you know, that's the thing you can manage. So you should manage it as much as you can before, and then get ready for all the stuff that will be new. And then I think also using your time well, you know, which is that there's only so much time together in the space, figuring out how it's going to look. And I mean, it's just everything in 4 days, you know, so how are you going to, with no director and no tech team, how are you going to like figure out the transitions or the beginning and the end of the show, which always takes so long? Like, how are you going to, you know, figure out that you're collectively telling the same story without all the things that we're used to having? You know, within the process, I was terrified and I was like, well, I don't think I can do this ever again. And then it happened and then I didn't die. And now I'm like, well, I've probably learned the most in those 4 days. I mean, it's in the top tier of experiences, I think, in terms of like what I learned about how I work best or what I need or how to really like prepare all my own stuff so I can try to get as far down the line as I possibly can. It's just like the things you're going to learn are going to be astronomical. So it's so worth it, even if like it's really scary and very stressful.
Well, thank you all so much. That will conclude our discussion on Extreme Shakespeare. And to sum it up, learn your lines, right?
Yes.
Pretty much.
To the process. Thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you all. It was so great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Hey, good to see you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh.